So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We might look weird to those here, but we're also broadcasting this on Facebook. Those that can attend can still kind of see it and leave some comments. We've had pretty good luck with residents, leaving comments on Facebook and all of that stuff. So I know I'm talking into a mic, and Brian's going to talk into this mic, and I know that you're not hearing it and probably don't really need it, but that's kind of what's going on. But I would like to welcome everybody to our public open house for Module 2 of our new Unified Land Development Ordinance. This is Brian Mabry with Kindig Keese. They're the consultant that's been helping us with this. And this is kind of the follow-up to our comprehensive plan processing that we started back a year and a half ago. And so he's going to go through what a ULDO is, but pretty much this is helping us modernize our development codes that were last touched in 1969. So of course, a lot of development things and a lot of technology and a lot of ways that cities do things have changed quite drastically since 1969. And so that's part of our process to bring us kind of back up to speed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's got a presentation here that he'll go through, and feel free to ask any questions or make any comments as he goes through it. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Garrett. And there are also a few posters you might have saw when you walked in that will be available if you want to take a look at them when we leave or when you leave. It's just sort of pretty much replicating what I'm going to be talking about here, but you can really look at those posters up close and see what's what. So Garrett kind of gave some background already. This is the follow-up, again, to the new comprehensive plan, which is a broad set of recommendations and policies for how the city is going to grow in the future. The ULDO, Unified Land Development Ordinance, is different in a few ways, and I have a slide in a moment that kind of describes some of those differences. But this second module has several parts to it, as you can see on the screen there. The first module, before I talk about Module 2, the first module, which I visited in June to talk about, was about zoning districts and land uses that go in those districts. So in zoning, a city like Borger is divided into several areas that are called zoning districts, and every part of the city has some kind of zoning district associated with it. And different land uses are allowed in those zoning districts. There are different building heights allowed in different zoning districts. There are different building setbacks from the front or the side or the rear that a building has to be depending on its zoning district. And Borger already has zoning, so this isn't introducing something brand new. It's, as Garrett said, sort of modernizing your current regulations that, again, haven't been very significantly, or haven't been overhauled since 1969 or 64 or something like that. So it's been a long time coming. Module 2 has several topics in it that you can see on the screen there: building and site design, subdivision standards, and those are the two areas where the bulk of the content is for this module. And then environmental management is sort of floodplain related, and that hasn't really changed from your current provisions. And then definitions, which are part of every module, because often you need to define what you're talking about in zoning in order for it to sometimes make sense. So we'll go through those and also be available for questions and comments. So I mentioned earlier that this is the follow-up to the comprehensive plan effort. And think of a comprehensive plan like a menu at a restaurant, and a ULDO like the cookbook for making something. So on a menu at a restaurant, there's kind of everything's laid out that you could have when you go eat there. In the same way, a comprehensive plan kind of shows different options for growth and has kind of vague policies about how the city's going to grow in the future. It's not very focused on how that's going to really happen specifically. There are some action steps in a comprehensive plan, but it doesn't get extremely detailed and doesn't get extremely timing oriented. But with a code, a land development ordinance, you can think of it again like the cookbook, where it talks about ingredients needed to make the meal, and think of that as sort of the pieces of property in town. How long to cook is another part of a recipe or a cookbook, and that's sort of the procedures for approval that are in a Unified Land Development Ordinance. A comprehensive plan, like a menu, often has a lot of pictures in it. There are still pictures in our ULDO/cookbook, but not quite as many usually as what a comprehensive plan is going to have. And again, it doesn't get into a lot of details. A menu doesn't show you how the thing is made that you're going to order. And then, again, the cookbook details how a building is going to look, or where it's going to be put on the property, or what kind of landscaping it's going to have, what kind of parking it's going to have. Those are all part of the ULDO, the Unified Land Development Ordinance. So general and kind of vague on purpose, and then on the other hand, specific and detailed are the kind of differences between what has already happened with your comprehensive plan and what we're working on now with the Unified Land Development Ordinance. So some things that a ULDO is and things that it can regulate and impact. It's really putting together your subdivision regulations and your zoning ordinance. So subdivision regulations are the rules about how when a property is subdivided into smaller lots, rules related to that and how streets can be laid out, how easements, like where utilities go, how they're laid out, how sidewalks are positioned and laid out. And then zoning, which is in your current chapter 14 of your city code, is how land is used, what kinds of how private property is put to use, whether it's an office or a factory or a house or an apartment complex or whatever the case may be. What kind of landscaping it has, again, how it's parked, what kind of amounts of parking it has, what kind of signs are allowed on that property. That's all what zoning covers. So when you put them together, when you put the subdivision chapter and the zoning chapter into one document, then it's a unified land development ordinance. And some of the advantages to that are shown on the screen. It gets rid of inconsistencies and duplications. So when you have two different chapters like that with subdivision and zoning, there's often duplications in like definitions, like the word street is a good example. That gets defined two different ways very frequently in the subdivision standards and the zoning ordinance. And by putting them together, we can see where those repetitions are and kind of get rid of and clean house and clean up the definitions. It's really a single source for development standards, so that a person doesn't have to look at two different chapters of the city code. It's an integrated document with things really dovetailed together so that they make sense, hopefully. Having that single document makes interpretation for city staff a lot easier. This is going to be a modernized document with a lot of graphics in it, and without written in a lot of legalese, like with hard to understand words. If you've ever read a legal document, it can be very confusing. A will or some other set of city laws or a contract. All those kind of things have big $5 words in them, heretofores and forthwiths and things like that. We avoid that kind of language. This is a legal document and it'll be legally defensible, but it's not too difficult for a lay person to understand. And user-friendliness, all that stuff that I just mentioned really amounts to user-friendliness for staff, for lay people, for real estate professionals, and all kinds of other folks that would use this document. So some things that a ULDO doesn't cover are on the screen now. A ULDO is not property tax policy. It doesn't set the property tax rate or assess individual properties in the city. That goes along every year with budget time, generally speaking. It's not about annexation. It doesn't talk about what parts in the outlying areas that are outside of the city limits should be annexed in the future. It's not a capital improvements program, so it's not, it doesn't lay out a schedule and a budget for extending streets or widening streets or extending utilities or adding bigger pipes underground or anything like that. That's something that many cities have, but it's that's more in the realm of the Public Works Department. So it's not building code either. It's not about the structure, interior structure of a building and how it's wired, or how many bathrooms it has, is required to have, or HVAC type matters like that. It can relate to how the outside of a building is designed to an extent, but it's definitely not about like the interior structural soundness of a building. It's not construction standards either. Construction standards, they go by different names, but that's policies and rules that, again, Public Works often administers that have to do with how much base goes on a street when a street's being built or being resurfaced, details about the curb and gutter dimensions, things like that, manhole locations and manhole sizes and covers and all things like that are construction standards and aren't addressed in the ULDO. And then finally, it's not about property maintenance or nuisances, so it doesn't force a landowner to clean up their property or maintain vacant property or buildings. Doesn't require them to get rid of nuisances like junk or weeds or other things like that, rodents. The city can have rules about that, usually in a chapter called nuisances, but it's not in this document. It can help with cleaning up some blighted properties, though, if it can have rules in it, and often, and this one has rules in it, that if there's a vacant piece of property and someone wants to build on it, then as part of that development process, that property is going to get cleaned up. It's going to have a new building on it. It's going to have maintenance or landscaping to an extent. It's going to have parking and that kind of thing, which will just, clean it up and turn it into a nicer piece of property. But it can't force just a sitting property to clean up itself unless some development activity is taking place on it. So that's all the things that a ULDO is not. Just think of it as the rules that apply on private property to land development, the land use, the signs, the landscaping, the parking, stuff like that. This process and project started in October on the ULDO with various activities. We are now in the main part, really, of the project of drafting in modules, which I'll show what Module 3 is going to have in it in a moment, but as I said, we're in Module 2. In March and May, we will move into the public review period where the actual written document will be posted online and be available probably as a hard copy if someone would need it that way. And we'll be getting ready for adoption by City Council in June of next year. So a little less, well, not even a little, less than a year to go here. 7 or 8 months or so to go. And like any ordinance, it has to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a public hearing, and then the City Council for another public hearing, and eventually adoption, we hope. So I've talked about the first module a little bit with the zoning districts, definitely talked about the second module. The third module of this project is going to be the review procedures and nonconformities or grandfathering, and how to address that. All of those 3 modules in the end around April or March are going to be put together into one document and dovetailed together and make sure that everything flows well. And then there'll be a public review draft that everyone will be able to look at and all that kind of stuff. We do have a sort of a staff committee who is reviewing the drafts as we work on them, the draft modules as we work on them. And we also have an ordinance advisory committee made up of various citizens who are looking and providing input on the drafts as we work on them. So we are getting feedback as we go along, and that's one of the reasons for having this thing tonight, is to try to get feedback from people on what we're working on. So now getting more into the content of the ULDO, and any images you're going to see in this presentation are from the code itself. So we have a good set of illustrations that are really descriptive and sort of coordinated and have the same look. I don't think there is a single illustration in your current regulations, and that was normal in the 60s, but you know, it's 2021 and it's very typical to have illustrations in a code, and we think these do well in the document. So there are some light standards for building design for single family and duplexes, and then a little additional standards for multiplexes, which are quads or quadruplexes, and apartments, and as well for non-residential and mixed-use buildings. Mixed use is just what it sounds like. You have, like in a downtown area especially, retail on the first floor and then residential space up on the upper floors. So there are different standards, not really related to building materials, because that's illegal to require certain building materials. Like you can't require brick or stone or other kinds of materials in Texas, but you can do other things like just the design of the buildings and having some visual interest, like just instead of having just a flat wall on the front of a shopping center, for example, to require just some level of columns or bump outs that just create some visual interest, or requiring that the building be in the downtown area or in a mixed-use setting closer to the street, built close up to the street, in order to have a more walkable environment. Those are all some of the things that are in this section. There's also requirements that we would call transitions, where if you have an apartment complex that's next door to a single-family residence, instead of having a big, you know, boxy, big apartment building right next to, you know, a modest house and potentially hurting that person's property values, we have instead some requirements that you can't have the apartment building in this example can't be too tall where it is right next to the house. It has to go over, and then it can have some more height after it's a certain, you know, number of feet away from the house next door. Then it can be 3 stories or 2 stories or whatever it would need to be. Similar standards related to quadruplexes again, and triplexes when they are next to a single family residence. We have parking requirements in this module. One thing that this module does, that the parking section does, that is in line with recent trends in zoning and parking, is to really not require as much parking as what previous ordinances might have required. So instead of requiring, for example, for an office to require 1 parking space per 200 square feet of the building, it's now 1 space per 300 square foot of the building. So the resulting number of spaces would be less. And that's because, you know, parking, especially with more online activities and with COVID and with the various, you know, other reasons, buildings often now don't need as much parking as they did in the past. And so having less parking has several benefits. It reduces what's called the heat island effect, where you have a bunch of paved area and the sun beating on it and it reflecting back and you know, heating up the area kind of gradually in the big picture of things. And it also, smaller parking lots reduce stormwater runoff that end up, you know, in the going into the storm sewer and putting, you know, just extra burden on processing the rainwater. So there are smaller parking areas as a result of these lessened parking requirements. We wouldn't want to reduce them so far that people are having to park, you know, in a street where parking isn't allowed. But we do want to reduce the size in the end, and sort of, you know, you almost let the business, you know, their template kind of figure out how much parking they need, and often they know they don't want to devote a ton of area to parking just in the interest of their own bottom line, in building, you know, a new building, like think of Walmart or whatever. We want to encourage the smaller parking areas. There's a lot of ability to have shared parking. So if you think of if someone built a new office and then had an apartment complex that kind of shared a parking area, those two land uses have two different times of day when their parking is in demand. The office, most of the parking is going to be from 8 to 5, basically on weekdays. The apartments or houses or whatever they are going to have more parking taking place at them in the morning before work and after work. So those are two completely different time periods where those two different land uses need parking. And so instead of making the office provide all of its parking and making the apartment provide all of its parking, we let them sort of collapse that parking a little bit so that they get a reduction in the amount of parking spaces that end up being required. There's other ways to get reductions that can, and that's through staff. That's an administrative approval. There isn't any kind of special hearing that needs to take place with the city council or planning commission or board of adjustment or anyone like that. But there are, if there is some kind of other reduction that the person doing the building needs, then they can also request even greater reductions through more of a variance process. We have graphics, again, that show the different parking arrangements, whether it's 90-degree parking, parallel parking, 45-degree, 66-degree parking, all kinds of different variables to show the size of parking spaces, their width, their length, and all that kind of stuff. We also have loading and stacking requirements. So on the left there is just kind of one of the graphics from the ULDO that shows loading areas would have to be screened with either, if they were next to a residence, for example, in order to cut down on some of those nuisances that you would find with loading spaces, have to be screened with either plantings or a berm or some kind of wall solid screening in order to, again, reduce those nuisances on the neighbors. Stacking is the other thing on the right. Stacking is requiring, for example, at a fast food restaurant or at a bank that has a drive-through, requiring that there be enough spaces on, or enough room on the site for vehicles to stack up, at the place where you order at, and then at the place where you pick up your food from the window, so that they aren't spilling out into the street and causing, problems as far as safety and such as that. There are landscaping and buffer yard provisions in the ULDO. A buffer yard is in the center picture there. There are two types of buffers, type A and type B, and let's just say that type A is the skinnier buffer with less plantings in it, and type B is a wider buffer with more plantings in it. And a type A would be required where there's not, like let's say you had a single-family residential zoning district over here with houses on it, and then over on the property next door, there's an office. There's not too much of a bad impact on the houses from an office, so it would be a type A buffer. And this gets spelled out, in much more detail than this in the code. But that would need like a type A buffer, 3 to 5 feet in width with a certain amount of plantings within it. If it were, on the other hand, single-family houses on this property over here and a factory over here, then the type B buffer would be required, which is wider and has more plantings within it. It can either be with a fence or without a fence in each of those types of buffers. If there is a fence or a wall, then fewer trees are required, and if there isn't a fence or a wall, then more trees are required in order to get that screening effect from either the fence or the wall or the trees there. There are some instances where what we call foundation plantings are required, where it's just kind of some kind of planting area right at the base of a building, and this is more in the commercial areas. We wouldn't be requiring that in an industrial setting just because the public doesn't really see them that much, see those kind of places that much. And then there are also some parking lot landscaping requirements, which again try to lessen that heat island effect and give more ground for rainwater to seep into before it goes down and gets into the the stormwater system. We have sign requirements in the ULDO. There is a Supreme Court case from 5 or so years ago that makes regulating signs a lot more difficult now than it used to, where you can't regulate signs based on their purpose. So you're not going to see in this ULDO something like a real estate sign or a church sign or an apartment sign, because that's all related to what the sign says or what its purpose is. You can only have rules about signs that relate to their structure. So A-frame or H-frame or wall sign or pole sign or monument sign, those are what you would find, because that's about the structure rather than the purpose of the sign. So each of the sign types are allowed in different zoning districts, so we're kind of going back to Module 1 content with that, talking about the zoning districts. Each of the sign types are allowed in different zoning districts. There's also each sign type, in this example it's a wall sign. There's an illustration of what we mean by wall sign, and then there are rules about how big it can be, how high up or how low down it can be on a building, the kind of illumination it would have, and then whether it requires a permit or not, a sign permit or not. Then there's some other stuff in each of those tables that gets captured there. There are some signs that are exempt from regulations, so like signs that the government puts up, whether it's the city, county, or federal government. Certain signs that are just very low impact or that are temporary don't require a sign permit. There are provisions about maintaining signs and installing signs. If there's a non-conforming sign, and by that I mean, let's say there's a big sign that a business has that is too big for what the new regulations allow for. That sign doesn't have to be torn down. It's considered non-conforming or grandfathered. And that sign can stay in existence. It can keep getting maintained and repainted or the rest cleaned off of it or whatever the case may be. It can also even have its sign face removed and a new one put on there. But it can't be substantially altered, structurally altered, without needing to then comply with the new regulations that would be in effect at that time. Outdoor lighting, this has to do not with really street lighting, but parking lot lighting. This just sets standards for protecting property values by preventing light from glaring onto other properties. Like think of you having a house and you have a business, a hotel or something next door, and they have lights that are glaring onto your backyard at night. That's not a very pleasant thing to have to deal with, and so this prevents that from happening and spilling out even onto the street as well and causing unsafe driving conditions. The subdivision standards are in here. This is so everything I talked about till now was about the private property and what can be done on the private side of property. This is about how streets are laid out, which are public property, how streets are laid out, where sidewalks go on the side of the street, how easements are laid out, how wide they can be, like for different types of utilities, whether it's water or wastewater or electrical or whatever you have. There's also provisions for not just the easements, but for actual operational standards to a point for water and wastewater and storm drainage. We have an article called Environmental Management. I'm close to the end of the tunnel here, right at the end of the tunnel. They have, this article has the city's floodplain standards in it, which have not really changed much, sort of just cleaned up and made easier to understand, but not substantially really changed very much. Definitions, we continue to work on definitions kind of as a work in progress as we go through each of the modules, but everything is defined that we think needs defining, but we always are adding things. Staff is very good about finding things that need to be added to the document or things that need to be defined. in the document, so that we keep it as easy to understand as we can. Earlier today, I presented this to the city council and staff, a little bit longer of a version than this presentation, but basically very similar. We're having the open house right now. Tomorrow, I'll present to the Ordinance Advisory Committee, which is the group of citizens who are reviewing the drafts. And then looking ahead, Module 3 will be providing that to staff in February of next year. And then I'll be making a trip here to talk about Module 3 in March, sort of like I'm doing now for Module 2. And that really wraps up my piece of this, and just wondered if anyone had any questions or comments so far. Yeah.
I was just wondering over there at the dome on that parking, is that a good example of how they're, it looks like they're not very much parking, they put all these little things around.
Yeah, Garrett's always good at answering the very localized questions that I'm less familiar with, so I'll pass them on.
It's partially some, of course, some of that is to accommodate the landscaping that we're gonna be adding to the parking lot. The dome's also a little special instance because we've also made provisions for power and data out there so that if we use the parking lot for events, so there'll be power distribution panels where you can plug in your booths or your carnivals or your other things. So that makes them a little larger. And of course, most of that actually has to do with turning radiuses and making sure that the cars are outside of turning radiuses from the roadways and stuff like that. And it was funny, Brad Carpenter, if you know Brad, he was here at the earlier meeting, and Brad works with the Hutchinson County ESU. And a lot of times in the past, with the school district, he and I used to direct traffic at the old football parking lot. And they've said the same thing about the new football field that's got all those islands, and they took up all of those spaces. But for those of us that used to have to corral cars, those are really handy because it creates defined flow, and you don't get somebody parking there that we have to get on the PA system and say, with the person driving the silver pickup, come move your car, you're blocking somebody in. And so it has a lot more to do with that than anything. But the dome does have a little extra space in areas where we're adding extra trees to create shade, and where we're adding power for for somebody to be able to plug into and use the parking lot for things other than just a parking lot.
And the parking, like where the football parking is, they could use that parking lot as well to walk down there, I guess.
Yeah, correct. We had the question, and for those that are listening or watching online, the question was that, using the football stadium parking lot for bigger events at the dome. And early on in our dome project discussions, we did reach out to the school and make sure that that would be an option. And they're definitely, because they know that they use, for big football games, they'll be using the dome parking lot, for big football games. And so it's definitely a give and take. So they've been really easy and great to work with on that. So they're happy for that, to let that happen too. Other questions? And I know we went through it. There's some more detail on the posters that you mentioned up there. Kind of what I told the council this morning, and I'm just going to kind of point out, really the bigger changes are some building design standards when you get a building over 100 feet, requiring some setbacks, just some architectural design features, choice of 8, so that's kind of one of the big changes, but that gets us away from having big square boxes when a building is over 12,000 square feet or over 100 feet. So that, I think, is one of the bigger changes. Of course, he went through parking. In most cases, parking is more, requirements have gone down a little bit because 1964 requirements were significantly larger than what they are now. But the bigger thing is also gives some more criteria for, more, it explains more, and he's talked about all the pictures and stuff like that. But like, we didn't have stacking regulations that he went over before, so when you put in a drive-through, there weren't really requirements. So, McDonald's could have allowed space for one car. Now, granted, that's not a good business decision for them, but, in this city, they could have, and so we want to definitely make sure that we accommodate more of that. But you know, having too much parking is actually detrimental to the city because those parking lots, they're impervious. So they add a lot of rainwater into the streets and into our stormwater system. So for the city, it's definitely a big balance between making sure that Walmart has more than 5 spaces, but do they really need 20,000 spaces? You know, so kind of what's the middle ground?
So the grandfather clause is still in effect as of today, right?
Right, yeah. Nothing that we do ever gets applied retroactively. There are very, very, very few exceptions. So what we're talking about here is mainly new construction or a change of use. And what we mean by that, so if somebody bought McDonald's because everybody finally, you know, I don't know, decided that they were gonna be healthy, and McDonald's closed, and I'm not saying that's ever gonna happen, but let's just say it did. And I know it won't happen, and the reason I know it won't happen is because I don't know, you know, I have never met a kid that freaking, that a Happy Meal and chicken nuggets and french fries is not the best thing ever. So I mean, that's why I'm using this as an example, because I know it will never happen. But if it did, and then somebody wanted to make it an office, then they would have to meet the new requirements because they changed its use. It was being used as a fast food restaurant, now it's being used as something else. So then the new regulations apply when you change the use. And like what we talked about earlier is that's when somebody builds something, that's really what you're doing. You're changing the use. It was an empty lot, and so now you're changing the use and putting a business on it, putting a home on it, doing something like that, and you change the use. And this is mainly how cities manage growth. And if you believe the theory or the history behind it, that's, you know, people come to cities for collective community and the convenience of services, and zoning is how we help protect the city and property holders as a whole. So it's not necessarily telling you you can't do things with your property, but it is. You know, we want to do it with some guidelines to help protect the person next to you.
About time.
And like I said, and we're excited about this because, you know, it is, from an administrative standpoint, it can be sometimes hard to enforce regulations that were developed in 1964 that we know don't make sense anymore. And so without changing them, we have to make those decisions, and anytime that we kind of stray from that, city staff starts becoming inconsistent. And when we're inconsistent, that a lot of times generates the #1 complaint. You know, our biggest problem and biggest citizen complaint is almost always generated from inconsistent actions. And so our goal is, how do we continue to go forward to make sure that we can be consistent? And you might not like what I tell you, but I feel better knowing that I told you the exact same thing I told Joe. And if I'm gonna make you unhappy, I wanna make sure that I at least made everybody unhappy with the same thing.
I just got one other question, is that Phillips over there by the dome, are they going to do anything afterwards, kind of make it?
Yeah, that is you're talking about the Alamo refinery. The question was, are we gonna do anything with the Alamo refinery? And that is a scope of the project. So it's actually gonna get landscaped, it's gonna have a sidewalk put around it, it's gonna be fenced, it's gonna be repainted. And we're working with the museum. We're actually going to have a museum description outdoor description exhibits for each piece of equipment. So you'll actually be able to go up there and say, this is a condenser and this is what the condenser does. And this is, you know, the cooling tower and this is what the cooling tower does. And so what a lot of people, and I'll tell you, for the longest time I was one of these, you know, to be honest, when I was a little kid, I just figured it was probably an old abandoned well and that was the tank battery that was left over. And nobody ever moved it, you know? I didn't know that we moved it there, but what it is the Alamo refinery. It is the first refinery that was ever put into use in this county. So there is quite a bit of history, and it is kind of unique and interesting when you know what it is, but what have we done to let people know what it is? And so that's part of this project. And with the donation from Nutrien to support this project too, we're also putting in a Nutrien Ag Park on the east side of the new dome facility, which will kind of be used for ag education and outreach opportunities, and to kind of see how fertilizer and ag benefits the community. So I think that's really cool to kind of tie the old Alamo refinery and that rich beginning oil and gas history of our community to to the ag business, because a lot of people think, it's hard to, it's really easy to think that Borger's nothing but oil and gas, but nutrient and all of that is really anything but, and so we do have a pretty good diverse economy, so I'm excited to see those two kind of play together there.
Somebody else's turn.
I even read on the nutrient today that they had given donation of $100,000 or something.
For this project, they've committed $287,000 over 5 years. And so we're definitely grateful of that. They understand the benefit of the facility, you know, for their employees and their business model and stuff too. It's gonna open up a lot of things, but we're excited about that in conjunction with the Unified Land Development Ordinance and some of the other modernizations that we're working on pushing through. We know that that everything's kind of a work in progress. And we know that the city can't stay still and meet the modern demands of a modern world. So we're trying to make sure that we set things in place to where we can be a little more adaptable and a little more responsive to those changes. It's just what I like to tell people, and I know some of the people here have heard me say this before, and they probably get tired of it, but you know, I try to tell people, you got to give me 3 things if you want to work with us. You have to understand, A, it's the government, so nothing's going to happen fast. Understand, B, it's the government, so you're probably not going to get exactly what you want. But understand, C, it's the government, so something will happen. But for the most part, luckily, being at the local level, you know, we are probably most responsive and most of the time can come to a much better conclusion than at higher other levels of government.
And Garen, I think it's important that people know that this all came out of the comprehensive plan, which was citizen involvement. It was citizens' decisions that they, you know, the input that they want to happen in Borger. That to me is really exciting.
Right, what the mayor was telling everybody, for those watching at home, is that she wanted to reiterate that this is a follow-up to the comprehensive plan that we recently adopted that did include a lot of citizen engagement. So we did, you know, citizen surveys, we had public hearings, we had focus groups, and so most of this supports a lot of the things that came out of that comp plan. We heard the need for sidewalks. We heard the need for more trees and better landscaping, you know, and so appearances and some of those things were definitely public feedback we got. And so we're moving towards a lot of that. And I think here shortly, I'll spoil a little bit to the council who we're gonna talk about this in tomorrow's work session with them, but we've got working on probably early next year, putting out an annual community survey and being part of the National City Survey Group with that, so that we can kind of measure where we sit and where our services sit with the citizens, so that we can better accurately respond to manage those perceptions and what we have. Because we kind of have to be careful in everything that we do and make sure that we're not being biased in what we think is important to the community versus what the community thinks is important to the community. And so that also, from an administrative side point of view, that the feedback for this and the feedback going forward with that, it gives me a lot better place when I sit there and say, well, with somebody that might not agree with it, as I understand that you might not agree with that, but here's the feedback and the engagement we've done, here's the survey data, you know, I understand that you might not like it, but you're definitely in the minority. And so how do we compromise and make this work for everybody?
Good luck on that.
What I've always said is sometimes people, I know that there have been some complaints for me, you know, especially over the years, that I talk too much. And what I tell people is everybody's gonna develop a perception regardless. Whether I say 1 word or 10 words, they're gonna develop a perception. So I say 10 words because if you're gonna develop a perception, I at least want it to be the correct perception. Doesn't mean you'll agree with it, but I want it to be based, you know, correctly and not incorrectly. Other questions? Well, we appreciate everybody coming. You know, we'll keep, like I said, we've got one more of these coming up in March with the next module 3, and then there'll be another one back towards June once we put all of this together and we kind of work through some of these last little bit of changes. But I appreciate those watching on Facebook at home. And be sure, if you are watching and you have any comments on Facebook, you know, we do read those. We might not always, you know, we are a pretty limited staff, so sometimes it takes us a little while to reply back or get comments, but we do see all of them. and we do take those changes into effect when we deal with things. But so those in the basement controlling this can in the Facebook part of this, and we will see y'all at the watching the council meeting tomorrow.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Hey, Karen. I forgot I had a big one, but this was that table he was